In the spring of 2001, a developmental psychologist from Boston walked through the gates of an orphanage in Bucharest, and the first thing he noticed was how quiet it was. The building held more than 100 children. Almost none of them were making any sound. There were babies in the cribs, toddlers behind the bars of metal playpens, older children sitting on the floor. They were fed and clothed. They were warm enough. By any inventory a government could take, the state was taking care of them, but they didn't cry. They didn't laugh. They didn't call out. They had learned very early that nobody was coming. The psychologist's name was Charles Nelson. He was about to start what would become one of the most important studies in the history of developmental science. By the time it was finished, the data he gathered would change what neuroscience knows about the first years of a human life. It would also leave behind a question that 25 years later we are more afraid to ask, not less, because the thing that happened to those Romanian children in measurable, brain-level detail is now starting to show up on the EEGs of children growing up perfectly fine in perfectly normal homes all across the developed world. This is the story of how we found that out. To understand what Nelson was looking at, you have to understand what made it. For almost a quarter of a century, Romania had been ruled by a dictator named Nicolae Ceausescu. In 1966, in an attempt to grow the population for industrial labor, he banned both abortion and contraception. He also made it nearly impossible for poor families to keep children they couldn't afford to feed. The result was tens of thousands of unwanted births and a network of state orphanages that grew over the next 2 decades into one of the largest institutional childcare systems anywhere in the world. By 1989, when Ceausescu was overthrown and executed by his own people, an estimated 170,000 Romanian children were living in those institutions. The photographs that came out of the buildings after the regime fell are some of the most haunting images of the 20th century. The world saw them and reacted with horror, but under the surface of the headlines, a quieter and more scientifically devastating story was just beginning. The children had not just been neglected, their brains had been changed by it. In 2000, the new Romanian government did something almost no sovereign state had ever done. It invited a team of American scientists in to study the children who were still inside the system, not just to document them, to run a randomized controlled trial, to take some of the children out of the institutions, place them with carefully vetted foster families, and then compare their development year after year to the children who stayed behind. The lead investigators were 3 names that anyone in developmental psychology now knows: Charles Nelson at Harvard, Nathan Fox at the University of Maryland, Charles Zena at Tulane. The project was called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, or BEIP. It began in 2001 with 136 children. 68 were randomized into foster care. 68 stayed. What it produced over the next 2 decades is the cleanest data we have on what early human deprivation does to a brain. The first finding was that the children's IQs were not low. They were catastrophically low. The average IQ of the institutionalized kids was 64. In any other population, that would be classified as intellectual disability. But IQ was the easy thing to see. What Nelson's team found when they put electrodes on the children's scalps was harder to look at. EEG measures the electrical activity of the brain. Healthy brains, even very young ones, produce a recognizable pattern of fast, organized waves, particularly in the alpha band, that go along with active, alert, engaged thinking. The institutionalized children's brains were producing almost none of it. Their EEGs looked like the wattage had been turned down. Slow waves where the fast ones should have been. Low power across nearly every channel. Nelson, years later, described it in plain English. He said the brains looked like they had fewer cells or fewer connections between cells than they were supposed to have. The deprivation hadn't only changed behavior, it had eaten into the brain itself. And here is where the study became uniquely valuable. Because the children who got moved to foster homes were tracked alongside the ones who stayed. Same tests, same EEGs, year after year, from 30 months all the way through adolescence and into early adulthood. The foster kids improved. In some areas like physical growth and brain electrical activity, they almost completely caught up. In other areas like IQ and attachment, they got a lot better but never fully closed the gap. The most important finding, though, was about timing. The kids placed with families before the age of 2 recovered far more than the ones placed after the age of 2. The brain, it turned out, was running a clock nobody had known to look for. Inside roughly the first 24 months of life, the human brain is doing something it never quite does again. It is being built around the responses it gets from another human being. Eye contact, the voice that comes when the baby cries, a hand resting on the back. These are not luxuries. These are the actual material the brain uses to wire itself together. Without that material, by around 24 months, something has already closed. This was the central finding of the Bucharest study. There is a window very early in human life when the brain expects to be in constant responsive contact with a caregiver. If the contact isn't there, the brain doesn't just feel worse, it builds itself differently. And a lot of what it builds is not undoable later. The world absorbed this slowly. The most concrete result is that Romania, on the back of these findings, made it illegal to place a child under the age of 2 in an institution. The orphanage warehouse model Ceausescu had built was finally shut down. The system was rebuilt around foster care. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Because 20 years later, in labs nowhere near Bucharest, in Singapore, in London, in Boston, in Toronto, researchers studying ordinary children in ordinary homes started seeing something on the EEG they had not expected to see. In 2023, a team in Singapore published the results of a longitudinal study called GUSTO. They had been tracking 506 children from birth. At 12 months of age, they asked the parents how much screen time their babies were getting. At 18 months, they put EEG electrodes on the kids' scalps and read their brain electrical activity. The babies who had been spending more time looking at screens, even after the researchers controlled for income, parental education, and just about everything else, showed the same pattern Nelson had seen in Bucharest. More slow-frequency activity, less power in the alpha band, the brain signature of cognitive underactivation. The team then followed those children to age 9, and they were finding measurable shortfalls in executive function, attention, and self-regulation. Now, before going further, one honest thing. The Singapore children are not orphans. They are not deprived in the brick and iron crib sense that the Romanian children were deprived. The effect sizes are smaller. The mechanisms aren't identical. Nobody in serious developmental science is saying a toddler with a tablet is in the same situation as a baby in a Bucharest crib. But the shape on the EEG is the same shape. Lowered cortical engagement during exactly the window of life when the brain is supposed to be doing the most building it will ever do. Less responsive contact with another human being, more passive intake of stimuli that don't respond when the baby reacts to them. A screen, from a baby's brain's point of view, has one important quality in common with an institutional crib in Bucharest. It doesn't look back. The Bucharest children were ignored by adults who were tired and overworked and resigned. The 12-month-old in the stroller staring at a tablet is being ignored. For that interval, by the person pushing the stroller. The interval is shorter. The ignoring is gentler. The food is better, and the love is real. But during that interval, the brain is doing the same thing it does in any environment where the human contact has been pulled away. It is building itself around the absence. If you're old enough to have grown up before the smartphone, this won't land the same way for you. If you're under 30 or you have small children of your own, it will. The average American toddler in 2026, between phones and televisions and tablets and the parent's own absorbed scrolling, spends more hours per day looking at a screen than the average institutionalized Romanian child in 1989 spent in any kind of active interaction with an adult. The cribs are gone. We rebuilt the same problem out of glass, and the brain doesn't know the difference. It only knows whether someone is there and whether they respond when it reaches for them. Bucharest is not an analogy. It is a calibration. It gave us a number, a range, a brain signature for what happens when responsive human contact drops below a certain threshold during the first 2 years of life. We now know what that threshold looks like on an EEG. And we are starting to see the same signature, fainter but unmistakable, in cohorts of children who, by every other measure, are growing up safe. The most haunting line in the entire Bucharest literature was written by Nelson himself almost as a side note in a 2007 paper. He noticed that the babies in the orphanages eventually stopped crying, not because they were content, because their brains had learned in the only way a brain that young knows how to learn, that crying didn't bring an adult. The brain stops asking for what it has figured out is not coming. There is a number somewhere between 0 and the kind of childhood you had where this starts to happen. We don't know exactly where it is. We may never know without running an experiment we don't have the moral right to run. But the data from Bucharest, joined now with the data coming out of Singapore and a dozen other long-term labs, is telling us the line is not where we thought it was. The babies in Ceausescu's orphanages were ignored by a state. The babies in the developed world right now are not being ignored. They are being responded to by everyone all day long in ways their grandparents could barely have imagined. But for a measurable fraction of the day, in the most important window of life their brains will ever pass through, a whole generation is being raised in front of devices that do not look back when they reach for them. We don't yet know what this will do to them across 30 years. We have one harrowing reference point half a world away that tells us the brain keeps score. The deprivation is no longer behind iron bars. It fits in the palm of a hand.